Hi, and welcome back to the Nuke. This has been a while. I haven't really been filming the past month, so I still kind of feel awkward filming in front of the camera again after a whole month. And today we'll be doing a wrap up. I did actually film an April wrap up a month ago. I shot it twice, and then the first edition, I didn't like the way that I was explaining things, and then the second time round, half of my audio was lost. So I figured I would wait until May was over and then do a total of like 2 months of wrap up. I think that's fine. As I've mentioned before, doing monthly wrap ups is not always the easiest way. I mean, it's not always like the most conducive way to explain the books that you've read, but I thought that I had enough books for the 2 months at least to draw some connections and to share them with you all. So that's that. I did not count the total number of books I read, maybe around 10, but many of these books are not like full-length books. Like small books or maybe graphic novels that are easy to read. So it's generally a mix of things as usual, and then of course I'll end with some song recommendations and a video recommendation as well, like on YouTube. So that's that. Let's just start with the first book. The first book that I did finish in April was Islands of Abandonment. So I did talk about this book in one of my April vlogs, I think. I did talk about my whole entire process reading the book, how I felt at different stages of me reading the book, and at the end of the day, I do think it's a good book. It's a nonfiction about places that humans have sort of abandoned or sort of made their mark in different ways. It can range from agricultural perspective, places where people used to farm, or it can also take on the form of like energy waste or toxic waste, chemical waste, things like that, and also about the margins of society, like places where human society just kind of slowly trickled out. So terms like urban decay, which I realized is actually a makeup brand. Things like that. So phenomenons surrounding human society and the environments that humans live in or used to live in, that kind of scenario. I do think it's a great general non-fiction book. I wouldn't say it's anything that's too theoretical or too difficult to understand. It takes on the form of very human-centric stories, which is my only caveat with the book, is that I wish that there were a lot more focus on the environments themselves, the places themselves, rather than the people inside them. Although Flyn does give very good descriptions of the place, I felt like her writing style was still very much centered on the human experience of these places, rather than really seeing the place as an equal actor to humans, and vice versa. So that was my only issue of the book, but otherwise I do think it's a great beginning kind of starter book when it comes to reading about the environments and reading about human interactions with environments and nature and things like that. So I do think it's a good general reading in that sense, but if you're looking for anything that's more theoretical or complex, you're definitely not going to get that in this book. Probably will have to follow up with other books that give you a bit more puzzling things to consider, but this one was pretty straightforward. So this is the second book that I finished. It's a graphic novel, and it's a very cute story about 3, I think, water beings. So 2 of them are mermaids and one of them is a sea witch, and they find themselves on land because they want to get some booze, but they quickly realize that they can't get back into the ocean where they came from. So it's a story about belonging and a story about queerness in a lot of ways, because they don't really fit into a lot of places. It's about them trying to find community as well. So it's a very heartwarming story, and everyone's very welcoming, and there's no real antagonistic fight. I mean, there's some misunderstandings here and there, but things get cleared up pretty quickly, and I really, really enjoyed it. I mean, it's a story about friendship, and it's really wholesome, great for a pick-me-up, mood booster, obviously, and I think the illustrations are just really nice as well. I mean, they're really easy to understand. And nothing too, like, off-putting. I think for me, I have read graphic novels that deal with dark themes before, and I do think it's a great medium to explore those things. But also, I think as a graphic novel, like the medium being so so reliant on visuals, it can also be such a huge, encouraging experience with the colors and with the visuals, like, and how the pacing of the story is. I just think it's a lot more of a enlivening experience than just reading text on a page. The next book that I finished after that was this book called I Contain Multitudes, The Microbes Within Us and a Grander View of Life by Yong. This book is a general science writing book. I picked this up because I thought it would be pretty similar to Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, and yeah, it is kind of similar in a lot of ways as I feel about most science writing nowadays. There's nothing particularly unique about this book as compared to other science writing books. It does follow pretty straightforward the format of explaining different elements of this one thing. In this case, it's the microbes, and generally, giving you an overview of what the field of research on microbes is right now. Like it's just more of like an informative book rather than anything that's thought-provoking or kind of radical in a way. So because of that, like, it is something that I had very clear expectations on, and it did deliver on that, which is just a great book about microbes. Definitely there are a lot of things here that I won't remember, like facts, so many facts, but I do think it's very useful to have an arsenal of just science books in general to refer to, especially when people don't read across different genres. I do think that for myself, it is really important to read across genres and to see connections across the different types of writing. So in science writing, there is a greater lean towards more ecological ways of thinking. So not so much studying things in isolation anymore, but to study things in systems, to study ecosystems, and to study everything as patterns and interactions, rather than just studying things in a very individual kind of taxonomic way, and so that has its elements in this book, and I do think generally that's a great thing that we can integrate across all types of thinking. It could be anthropological, it could be literary, it could be political, to see a common theme across all these areas of studies and of thought. And also, I've been such a science nerd from young, so this was a really fun book for me to enjoy. I could just immerse myself in it for a good 1 hour, 2 hours a day, and then just forget about everything else in my life, just because it's so specific and so niche. So I do think for you science nerds, you would like it, but for those of you who've never really read science writing, by nature, I do think science writing is a bit more technical and difficult to understand, but I do think it's a good challenge nonetheless, in a way to expand the things that we know or the things that we can refer to. So that's that. The next book I finished was Healing Resistance, A Radically Different Response to Harm by Kazu Haga. Now this book has been on my TBR for the longest time, and I managed to read it pretty quickly. It isn't anything too theoretical. I think as compared to maybe, I would say the most similar book I've read before is Adrienne Marie Brown's books on activism. So things like Emergent Strategy would be pretty similar in a way that the book aims to give activists a kind of framework to create communities and to kind of build revolutions from the ground up. So I do think it's a similar mindset, but I do think Kazu Haga's book is more vague and more broad, and it talks about very general philosophical principles of compassion as a response to harm. So I guess the biggest thing that stood out to me in this book particularly was the idea of a beloved community, that no matter what activism you're involved in, it should all aim towards including everyone in this idea of a beloved community, which I think is a pretty powerful message to stick to and to hold, to live your life by. But in terms of the book itself, I didn't think it was the most helpful, like useful framework. I do think it's nice to read about his experiences, training people, facilitating difficult conversations. That was like the interesting part of the book. But in terms of really practical frameworks, that only really came in the last, I think, chapter of the book. And even then, because it was only one chapter, it wasn't very, very elaborate or comprehensive as compared to, like, you know, people like Adrienne Marie Brown, which I feel like, you know, she provides so much more of a framework that you can really integrate and apply in your life. Whereas I think Kazu Haga was talking a bit more from an ideological point of view, which is alright. It was relatively easy reading. Reads a little bit like self-help in terms of the language, so maybe that's why I didn't really benefit so much from it. But I'm glad that at least I read it, because it has been on my TBR for a very long time, and I still think it is pretty useful, especially for more of a general audience, like not necessarily people who are involved in activism in their own ways, but just generally people who want to have a shift of mindset, how they themselves as perpetrators or people who have harmed others, how they can also regard themselves and regard the communities around them. So I think that would be useful in a more general sense, but according to, I mean, as an activist framework toolkit kind of book, it isn't the most specific. Yeah. The next book I finished was Potong, To Care, cut by Johnny John. So this was sent to me by Ethos Books, and Ethos has sent me several books before, and they've sent me like a whole range of non-fiction, plays, fiction, all whatever they have currently. And this is a book that contains 2 of Johnny John's plays. They are published in Malay, but the translations are included in the book itself. So it has the English, as it has the Malay, and then it has the translation in brackets after. So it is kind of useful to have the English translations as you read along, but this kind of makes me feel like it's meant for an English reading audience mostly, because it does disrupt the flow of the play a lot. I think if, you know, I mean, I do read a little bit of Bahasa, but not super fluently. I feel like if the Bahasa was just like on this side and then the English translation was on the right side, you could actually just read the Malay, like the original play in Malay, like on the left, so you don't have to refer to the English. If you don't have to, so that you can actually read the original play in its original form. I mean, that's my own preference, I think, when it comes to translation, I think, with this kind of book, because there's some portions where the character does speak a lot, and then it just gets disrupted by all these brackets of English. And I think if you're someone that does speak both Bahasa and English, it would feel quite repetitive to have to read the Malay and then the English all the time, like simultaneously. As much as you don't want to, it's formatted that way, so you can't really avoid it, I think. So that was my only issue with the formatting of the book. But otherwise, the plays are great. Actually, the plays were published quite a while back, but even when they were published a while back, I still think that the contents and the characters are still so like relevant. Again, a while back, I wouldn't say like a decade ago. I mean, it's within the decade, but the characters, I feel, were very real, very like real life characters, very everyday characters, and they all are so complex. Like, everyone doesn't reveal everything, and I think that's the great thing, that characters reveal bits and parts of themselves slowly as the play progresses, and I like that a lot. I mean, I do think it really captures everyday conversations so well, and there were a lot of really witty puns in Malay that couldn't really be translated into English. So it also depends on the delivery of the actors themselves when they do the play out. And I know that Ethos published this book alongside like collaborating with the theatre house. It's great that we can have more of this collaborative effort to revive like the plays in different formats. I really enjoyed it. I do think I preferred the first play called Hawa, where there is a new Muslim convert and she's trying to organize the funeral of her partner, and you know, it's kind of implied, I think, towards the end that there are a lot of like negotiations of being a new Muslim, but also like trying to honor the rights that come with Islamic faith, but also trying to, like, everyone's just trying their best to figure out how to do the rights in a respectful way. I mean, it's really fun. I mean, I really enjoyed reading it. It was very fun, but also very thoughtful at the same time. Yeah, and Potong means to, like, to cut. So it just literally means to cut. But I like how there's a subtitle of, like, to care, that, you know, the act of cutting can be seen as like an act of letting go, but in these two plays as an act of, like, respect and an act of, like, figuring out familial ties. Yeah, so I like that. The next two books I read were these two books from the Green Ideas series of the Penguin House thingy. I don't know. I mean, this has been published for a while. I think maybe a year plus, like 2 years. And I've read, like, a few of their mini books as well. So first I did pick up this one. The Dragonfly Will Be the Messiah by Masanobu Fukuoka. And this was the guy that wrote the Farm Revolution book, like the One Straw Revolution. So he advocates on natural farming. And it was interesting to see his backstory a little bit in this book. He talked about how he was a scientist, researcher, and he was working in very, like, clinical settings, but he realized that his calling was to be in the fields and to figure from scratch, right, like how to grow plants naturally, how to harvest the crops naturally. And it took him a long time. I do think that he emphasized how long it took. Like, he had to do things from trial and error so much more because, like, you know, even though he came from a clinical background, he believed in really, like, working the soil and really adjusting as things go by. So I thought it was really cool that he was so steadfast in his belief in this kind of natural farming methods, which now are getting much more popular. But I think in his time, when everyone was like, oh, agricultural technological revolution, right, like the whole era of GMO seeds, and which, you know, is interesting and all, but, like, at that time he was really, really, like, singularly invested in that natural farming method. So that's really interesting to read in the context of today. And I do think I mean, his full book has been on my TBR for a long time, so maybe it's a good time to pick it up finally. After that, I did actually purchase this book for myself, and it's Hot Money by Naomi Klein. Now, I've always liked Naomi Klein's writing. However, I do think that her later books are targeted towards a younger audience. So I haven't really picked up her most recent works, but definitely, like, her mid-career works are the best in my opinion. This Changes Everything was the book that really catalyzed my whole journey to reading about the environment and about capitalism and about, like, the whole system of oppression and destruction and things like that. So her book was really the one that catalyzed all of that. So I've always loved her way of very, like, scathing journalism. Like, she doesn't hide anything. She's just like, this is the problem, and this is, like, there's very clear calls to action, and she doesn't really blame, like, the individual. Like, she believes in collective organizing, but also in really pinpointing specific actors in power, which I think is a great voice, is a much needed voice, obviously, because I also really believe in that, that, you know, as much as individuals can do what we can, ultimately we still need collective organizing, and we also need very directed accountability from certain people. So I mean, this book was pretty simple read. It's very straightforward. It's nothing new necessarily. I just think it's a very good reminder and a very good summary of the ideas that she presents in This Changes Everything, and also some of her other works, like Disaster Capitalism, I think. So I wouldn't say it's, like, the best book to read by itself, but I do think it's a good book to refresh your ideas and to also share with people, I feel. Also, compared to the other books, like, this book in the mini-series is a bit thicker than the others. After that, I did read 2 more books. So the next book I read was Vacant Steps by Stephen Tsai. So we'll put it here. It's a novel, like it's a adventure, fantasy, fiction that was greatly inspired by Mongolian, I think, like, stories, folk tales, maybe like history as well. Now Stephen Tsai is actually someone that I sort of know by acquaintance. Like, okay, I don't know him by acquaintance, but he is someone that is from my alma mater, so I did not know that he published a book. I saw it during the kind of Singapore Writers Festival, and it seemed like a lot of people had great reviews about it, so I decided to pick up the book, and I enjoyed it a lot. Actually, I really enjoyed the story much more than I expected. It is kind of like a very classic storyline. You have wartime between tribes, and a great leader emerges to merge the tribes. There's a huge enemy. Everyone's trying to claim ownership of this one very precious resource, and characters are just like conflicting, characters are just like fighting, so I usually don't read these kinds of genres because I don't really like action. I can't get into it. I don't find the thrill in reading this kind of action novels, but I do think that this novel is great. I do think it delivers a lot on the intricacies of legacy and intergenerational, trauma. And actually, one thing that I learned from Healing Resistance, like Kazu Haga's book, was this idea of intergenerational wisdom. As much as we inherit trauma, we also inherit wisdom from the people before us. And I actually see this a lot in Stephen's book, which is about how do you deal with the legacy that you've inherited. And the action, I can't really comment on it because I kind of glossed over the fighting scenes, but I really loved how there were multiple character perspectives. So you actually followed 3 main characters, Sarah, Batu, and Errol, I think. And it's so interesting because they occupy such different perspectives in the context of the war, right? And Sarah is this person that, whose brother was supposed to be the next leader in line of her tribe, but because of circumstances, like, she becomes the leader, and there's a lot of conversation about what makes a good leader in times of crisis. I thought that was great as well, and that leadership can be seen in different ways. And what I really liked about the story was the very natural stepping up of younger generation leaders, but not in a way that was like power hungry, but in a way that was so intentional, and also in a way that showed different character flaws and how trust could be created and maintained throughout all these communities. I thought it was great. I mean, I thought it was such a great study into how relationships could really be maintained over time. And I really loved the whole inheriting your father's past. I mean, I guess in this context it's mostly the father's past, and really reckoning with your family history. I thought that was all really great. So even though it was set in a very fantastical, I mean, it's a fantasy novel, right? So it is set in a different setting from today, but it kind of made me think about that, like in today's context, what can we do to support the younger leaders of today? What can we do to really support and nurture leadership in times of crisis, in times of conflict? Those were the questions that came to me as I read the book, and as I finished. And I do think Stephen gave a very great development of the characters that shows a way forward for communities to really believe and trust their younger leaders. So I thought that was great. I mean, I enjoyed it unexpectedly. Again, not anything about the author or the genre, I just don't read this genre a lot, so I'm glad. And if you have any similar books that follow this kind of theme, do let me know. I'm quite interested, and I think I learned quite a lot from this book as well. So that's that. Do check it out. Also, I still keep to my promise of like wanting to read mostly Southeast Asian authors, and Stephen is indeed from this region. Moving on to the very last book that I finished. The book is called Atlas of AI, Power, Politics, and the Planetary Cost of Artificial Intelligence by Kate Crawford. Now, this is a huge book. This is a book that a viewer actually recommended to me. Thank you for recommending that book. It is a great book indeed. I do think that AI technology, this whole area of things, is something that I've always wanted to read more about. And I do have a few books on technology that I have recommended on this channel before, but it has never really been a priority on my reading list just because there's so many other things I want to read. So I'm glad that I kind of bumped this up and decided to finish it. It is exactly what it talks about, which is AI, and talks about the kind of hidden worlds of AI that generally we as the public don't really think about, or has been kind of intentionally obscured from us. And I love the way that the author opened up the entire book by talking about, studying the AI as an atlas, right? Rather than saying that this is exactly what it is to figure out different perspectives on the same topic and to see it all as like connected themes. And I like how it was very explicitly like decolonial in a way, because I don't remember whether Crawford actually uses the word decolonial, but she did talk a lot about how she wanted to move away from the Western-centric lens of studying everything and to really see an overarching picture of how systems of AI affect different people on such different scales. And I love how she actually recognized this at the start. Like, she acknowledged that a lot of the work on AI has always been Western-centric. Even the data sets and the people it benefits has always been kind of in the same few areas, and it also hugely kind of devalues people in the margins. So I really love that she opened the book this way. I do think a lot of authors can afford to open books in similar ways, and to recognize that there are certain things that you can't really cover in your capacity as a researcher. I think that's really important, because for me, like, I don't mind it if people only use West-centric examples or theories, as long as they're aware of it and you encourage other people to take on different examples and different case studies and different perspectives to study the same thing. I think that's what matters to me, is like the acknowledgement of how skewed their stuff can be. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So this book, I think, is a great book. Definitely something that echoes a lot of the anxiety around AI and technology nowadays, talking about how like there's this mysticism around technology that we cannot explain, kind of the helplessness when it comes to data heavy industries, things that are so reliant on data, the fact that we are living in surveillance societies, people can't really opt out of it anymore. And it talks also about the material harms of the whole industry, the fact that our digital products also have to stem from somewhere. They have to be part of the earth, the mining of precious metals to create certain certain technical stuff. The fact that our internet services require such large consumptions of energy and also space in certain areas, that actually wired to electricity. As much as we use terms like the cloud to refer to technology, to talk about how like seamless and how like immaterial these things are, the fact is that all these things are still very much material, very much stemming from our environment, very much involving exploitation of like human labor and all that. And I think it was a really good book to remind people of how AI was just a continuation of this kind of technological exploitation of people and the planet. So it isn't something new. I just think it's something that people don't normally think about, and I think because of that, it's a great book to really think about, and it's very thought-provoking. I really love it. I do think it's something that I would want to read again, maybe in relation to other books on tech. I read it a little bit in isolation, so a lot of the ideas are still floating around my head. They're not really rooted yet in threads of thought, like coherent threads of thought, so I would probably have to come up with a reading list. I keep saying that, like, in every video I want to come up with reading lists for everything. Because I believe that books have to be read in relation to other books. If not, you don't have anything that connects, and you don't get to have your own insights on things. So that's that. Yes, and I also forgot to mention two books that I did read as well. Poetry. So I did read quite a range of books the past 2 months. I read this one called Poetry Rebellion, Poems and Prose to Rewild the Spirit. I didn't really like it. I kind of briefly read through it because I have been thinking a lot about poetry, like the role of poetry in the climate crisis. Again, just generally thinking about fiction and thinking about like creative writing in the climate crisis, because I believe that you need to have both provocative nonfiction, but also really like imaginative work in this whole thing. I thought that introduction was great. I mean, it talked about the need for poetry in thinking about environment, connecting to our environment. But the poems themselves, the first half, were just like typical like white dudes. So I was a bit confused because I thought that the book was supposed to be a lot more diverse, a lot more inclusive, but the first half was not really. Only in the second half were there some excerpts from different poems, different poets across time. So I did see some poems, like Chinese translated poems, like dated far back. Didn't really think it lived up to what it wanted to do. Like I think the concept is still really good, like the concept of having anthologies of poems relating to environment. It didn't really capture the intention of the book, unfortunately. So I still think it's a good idea. So maybe if I can find similar anthologies, I would read those instead and see how that measures up to this. Now, the last book that I want to talk about is Red Earth by Esther Vincent. It's a poetry collection, so it's a collection of all her poems, and it follows the theme of like her reckoning with the natural world. So a lot of it talks about, you know, different elements of like encounters with nature. There's also this part where she's, you know, reflecting on the artificiality of the Singaporean environment. And I do think I resonate a lot with her poems because I do occupy a very similar position in which, I mean, I live in Singapore and I do live in this kind of very detached city lifestyle in Singapore, right? Like I don't really have very strong roots to the environment. Ishpi is having a bit of a zoomies, so let me just keep her here. But yeah, so I really did enjoy this book. Because I do think I occupy a very similar like alienated position to her when it comes to like Singapore's environmental history and all that. She was actually one of the editors of Making Kin, ecofeminism, I think essays in Singapore, ecofeminist essays in Singapore. So I think that really is like the thread of ideas that she's very personally invested in, and I do think it's a great contribution to environmental thought in Singapore, you know, kind of merging the personal as political in Singapore. It's a thing that we don't really see so much, I think, especially when things here can get either really like clinical, very like sterile, or it becomes something too obscure for the general public to understand. Let me just talk about the two books that I did not finish, like books I dropped. So the first book I dropped was Lost Feast, Culinary, Extinction, and the Future of Food by Lenore, Newman. This book started out fine. It talked about different foods that are slowly going extinct, I guess, because of modern agriculture, monocrops and things like that, or like various different things, maybe like even the loss of insects, etc. The reason I dropped this book was because of the tone of the author. First of all, like, it was a bit self-indulgent. Like, the author spent a lot of time talking about her own feelings about things rather than to really tell you the significance of those thoughts. It was just like, I felt bad on this day, and she would spend quite a lot of time talking about how her friend would whip up a meal for her. It was a bit tangential to the topic at hand, so it was a bit distracting. Also, it didn't seem that Newman had a very good understanding of, you know, cultures and differences in culinary cultures and all that. Like, she had a bit of an exotic slant, you know, exotic tone when she was talking about cultures in different countries. So and some examples that she used were not very accurate. So I felt like it wasn't a very well researched like background. It seemed like she was not really very intentional about the examples that she used. It wasn't really like edited, or it wasn't really like anything that people read, like proofread for sensitivity to differences in culture. So because of that, it wasn't anything explicitly like racist or like exoticizing, but I just felt like there probably are other better books that I can read relating to the same topic, and I did find another book that I'm reading that has a bit of a better perspective on this topic, so I did drop this book, unfortunately. The second book that I dropped was The Intersectional Environmentalist, How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and the Planet by Leah Thomas. Now, I had great expectations for this book, which is probably why I became quite disappointed by the book. Leah Thomas is quite well known as like a activist, like a young activist, especially on social media. She does a lot of these very informative infographics on how to be intersectional in your environmentalism, which is great. I do think it's a very much needed voice in the field of like young environmental activism. The reason I dropped this book was because of reasons that I talked about relating to the Atlas of AI, was that Leah Thomas kept talking about intersectionality and kept talking about the need to like move away from like white patriarchy and like white dominant structures, but the only examples she ever gave were of like black communities in the US. And although those examples are great, I mean those examples are very necessary to critique how white-centric environmental movements are in the US, those examples are great, but because she was talking about intersectionality, I just thought it didn't really live up to its name. It didn't really talk about, you know, examples outside. Like she just kind of clumped every example as like black, Hispanic and non-white communities in the US. So I was really perplexed, like where is the outside of the US context? What about like different countries, right? What about like intersections with colonialism? What about that? You know, so I had really high expectations. Maybe that's why I dropped the book in the end, because she did not even mention anything outside the US. But I was listening to it as an audiobook, so maybe there's some parts towards the end where she did mention it and I didn't know. So if you've read it before, let me know if the book actually turns out better. I don't know whether I want to give it a second chance, because, you know, if you're using a word like intersectional, I do expect you to at least talk beyond the US context. Unfortunately, I think that's the very bare minimum, and in the first few chapters I didn't get a sense of that, so I decided to drop the book. For the books I'm currently reading, the first book is The Fate of Food, What We'll Eat in a Bigger, Hotter, Smarter World by Amanda Little. Now, this is still like a white woman's perspective, unfortunately, like on food. If you know any other books on food that are a bit more of a, you know, non-white perspective, I would really appreciate it. That's when I realized that a lot of books on food are either like too specific on certain ethnic groups or like certain profiles of people, or it's like very general but written from a very like white perspective. So anyway, this book is like slightly better than the Lost Feast one, because of the tone. Like it's a little bit more respectful to different cultures, and it actually draws on examples beyond the US. So that was my major reason for moving to this book instead. So it did talk about certain examples in Africa and GMO foods. I also do think it talks, I think, different countries as well. I'm not far along in the book at all. I only in the first 2 chapters, so that is much more, that's a big improvement in my opinion, honestly, which is kind of sad, but it does deal very similar themes. Thinking about the future of food, how are we going to get our food, how are we going to ensure food security for different countries, different people, and our general perspectives towards food and how that might change with the climate and also with new technologies. So I think it's a great book to read about, you know, food systems in general, but we'll see after I finish the entire book. And the last book I am reading currently is Global City Futures, Desire and Development by Natalie Oswin. So this is a theme that I recently have been thinking about, like queer geography. Yeah, and actually Singapore is indeed a very like straight space, very heteronormative space, but I never really found a way to articulate that. You know, this book literally aims to articulate that. I mean, it literally talks about how politics of space in Singapore really reinforce this heteronormativity that, you know, queers a lot of people out of its space. Not just people who explicitly identify as LGBTQ+, but also people who don't fit into the very narrow conception of a nuclear family. So I am really enjoying the book so far. I mean, it's a very academic book, so it does detail all the different like political histories that relate to the context of queer spaces in Singapore. And subsequently, I do think it's a very academically rigorous book, but I am enjoying it because I haven't really read like a Singaporean academic nonfiction in a while, so I am enjoying this a lot. And because it's Pride Month in Singapore today, I just wanted to read more, you know, queer related books in Singapore, which has always been a thing on my bookshelf, like on my TBR. It's just that periodically I need to remind myself that this is also something important to me as well. So that's that. I have finally finished talking about all the books in this wrap up. Now we're going to talk about the music and video recommendation. Now the two songs I want to recommend is Balming Tiger's song called Just Fun. The very funny thing, I just realized that I just found out that Balming Tiger was, you know, an artist collection. Is an artist collection, like singers and just general experimental creative collective of people. What am I saying, collection? And they have done some of the songs that I love. Like I mean I have them in my playlist already, but I didn't even know that they did other things on their channel. So they actually do short, like animation shorts on important like Asian figures. So I think that was great as well. The next song is Good Times and Problems by Jungle. This was a recent music video that came out, but I've always enjoyed their music videos. Like their dancing is just so natural and so lovely and so groovy, and the songs are just so feel good. So I have always enjoyed watching their stuff because I do think it's like dancers' songs. Like, you know, it feels like a song that has a very like genuine danceability to it. So I mean that's why I really enjoy it, and it's very groovy. I love it as well. Yeah, and the video that I want to recommend to wrap up this entire thing is Even Leftists Don't Talk About Animals by The Liberal Cook. Just having absolute zoomies right now. I have talked about The Liberal Cook on my channel multiple times before, and I do think that they do a great job in talking about certain topics, like leftist topics, in a very like accessible manner and in a very entertaining way as well. I mean, I do think there is great thought that's placed into the characters and the flow of the argument and all that. So that was really nice, and I am so glad that they have done this video essay on veganism, because honestly, veganism is a topic that I think divides a lot of people. Previously I did do a video on a vegan mukbang, and I think quite a lot of people had comments about it, like personally but also in the general comments. And I always thought it was a very interesting thing that veganism can get so many people riled up in different ways. Some people feel very strongly about it, some people oppose it very strongly as well. I myself find it, I mean, after watching this video essay, I had a better understanding of why I choose to eat vegan as much as possible, because veganism is, you know, an expression of like your political identity. I mean, to see it as a form of praxis in itself is the best way that I would approach veganism. It's also the whole political is personal thing. People might say, what can you as an individual do against the entire industry? But I think people tend to forget that, you know, the political always stems from something personal. Like these 2 months, I did read quite a lot of books about suffering, and a lot about how we can at least take a personal step towards that suffering. And I apologize for like Asian P making so much noise in the background. She's just having absolutely so much fun right now. Hey! Yeah, so with that, I'm gonna end the video here. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this wrap up. It's been a long time coming, yeah, and I just feel so awkward in front of the camera still, but thank you so much for supporting my channel all the way and for still being here. I think for me, moving forward, I've had a lot of struggles, like being in front of the camera again and filming all these videos and editing them. It's really like a creative block and a mental block as well, so I hope you all understand. But I still will stand true to my booktube origins, and I still want to recommend books to you all, so you can still expect book related content from me. But I know some of you want me to do commentaries on, like, you know, capitalism and all that, but I still believe that, you know, reading books, I want to encourage you all to read the books and to form your opinions and to be educated in your context. And I want to just tell you what I think about capitalism. I want to be able to share different ideas with you, and then we can all have different conversations on what different terms mean to us in our different contexts. So I think that's really important to me. And for those of you who still want to hear like my commentaries on capitalism and all that, unfortunately I still think I'm in a stage of like processing a lot of things. I don't really have much to say, unfortunately. I don't really think I'm someone that would say things if they're half formed. So with regards to commentary, I don't think I can really give you like full length video essays anytime soon. I am still very much in the process of learning, processing, and just sharing ideas as much as possible for us all to really think about and to sit on. So that's where I'm at. Yeah, so thank you so much for watching still, and I hope to see you in the next video. Most likely it'll still be about books. Yeah. But I hope you're staying safe. Do take care wherever you are. Hope you're having a lovely day. If you're not, I hope that you get a good night's rest tonight, because you deserve it, and drink lots of water. Take care of yourself. It's getting really, really hot in some parts of Singapore nowadays, so do remember to get hydrated. That's really important. And take care. So till then, bye.